The night was quiet, too quiet. The sound of tires crunching over gravel was the only thing breaking the silence as a black Jeep rolled down a dimly lit street. Inside, Marcus, a well-dressed man in his late 40s, adjusted his rearview mirror and sighed. He had dealt with countless cases of misconduct in his career, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just investigating reports of rogue officers, he was here to dismiss them. But before Marcus could even reach his destination, flashing red and blue lights filled his mirrors. A patrol car pulled up behind him, sirens blaring. He knew exactly what this was. He'd read the complaints. This wasn't a traffic stop, it was an ambush. "Step out of the vehicle," a voice barked through a megaphone. Marcus barely had time to react before a group of uniformed officers swarmed his Jeep. He kept his hands on the wheel, calm but watchful. Instead of following protocol, the cops did something shocking. One officer grinned as he raised his baton and, without warning, smashed it against the driver's side window. Glass shattered, scattering over Marcus's lap. Another officer joined in, pounding dents into the hood with his flashlight. Marcus didn't flinch. He had heard the stories, seen the footage of these very officers treating citizens like punching bags, but experiencing it firsthand was something else. "Out now," one of them yelled. Slowly, Marcus pushed open the broken door and stepped out, his hands raised just enough to show he wasn't a threat. His sharp eyes studied the men in front of him. They had no idea who he was. No idea that the man they were roughing up wasn't some random driver, but the very inspector sent to terminate their jobs. One officer smirked. "Nice car. Too bad it's totaled." The others chuckled, their breath visible in the cold air. Marcus took a deep breath, wiping a drop of blood from a cut on his forehead. He could end this right now. Pull out his badge, say his name, watch their faces drop. But no, not yet. He wanted to see just how far they were willing to go. As they circled him, the night took on an eerie stillness. Marcus met the eyes of the officer who seemed to be in charge. "License and registration," the officer said, voice dripping with arrogance. Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out his ID, but instead of a driver's license, he held up something that would turn their world upside down. "Inspector Marcus Daniels," he said, his voice steady. "Internal affairs." Silence. The smirks vanished. The color drained from their faces, and just like that, the hunters realized they had just walked into their own trap. The silence hung heavy in the air. The officers stared at Marcus, their faces frozen somewhere between shock and panic. A moment ago, they had been laughing, enjoying the power they thought they had over him. Now, that power was slipping through their fingers, and they knew it. One of them, a tall officer with a buzz cut, forced out a chuckle. "Nice try," he said, shaking his head. "Anyone can print a fake badge." Marcus didn't react. He simply held his ground, letting them squirm. He had been in this position before, watching corrupt officers struggle to find a way out once they realized they had made a mistake. Some tried to play tough. Others went straight to apologies. He had seen it all. "You don't believe me," Marcus said, tilting his head slightly. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Then go ahead. Call it in." For a split second, none of them moved. They knew that if they radioed dispatch and confirmed his identity, this would be over. Their careers, their pensions, everything could be on the line. But ignoring it wasn't an option either. Too many witnesses had already seen them. The cracked windshield, the broken glass at Marcus's feet, the dents in his Jeep, it all told a story that couldn't be undone. A younger officer, probably in his late 20s, shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't been the one to smash the window. He hadn't laughed when his partner cracked the hood with his flashlight, but he had stood by and done nothing. Now he was realizing just how deep he was in. The officer with the buzz cut finally spoke again, his tone different this time, less cocky, more controlled. "Let's not jump to conclusions here," he said, lifting a hand like he was trying to calm the situation. "We had a report of a suspicious vehicle in the area, just doing our job." Marcus let out a slow breath, watching the gears turn in their heads as they scrambled for an excuse. He knew the game. This wasn't about a suspicious vehicle. It was about intimidation, about power. He had read the reports: citizens harassed, cars searched without reason, people arrested for questioning their actions. And the worst part, these officers had gotten away with it for too long. A radio crackled from one of their belts. Static filled the air before a voice came through. "Unit 4, what's your status?" The officers hesitated. If they didn't respond soon, someone would start asking questions. The young officer glanced at Marcus, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. The weight of the moment was pressing down on all of them. Marcus took a step forward, his steady gaze locking onto the officer in charge. "Answer the radio," he said, voice steady, "and tell them the truth." The officer hesitated, his hand hovering over his radio. The weight of Marcus's words lingered, thick in the cold air. The others weren't saying a word now. They were waiting, watching, calculating. What was the best way out of this? Could they talk their way out? Could they shift the blame? Buzzcut's jaw tightened, and without breaking eye contact with Marcus, he pressed the button on his radio. "Unit 4, we're code 4, he said, just clearing a stop. His voice was steady, but there was something else behind it, something strained. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. They were buying time. He had seen it before. He could practically hear their thoughts racing, scrambling for a way to flip the situation in their favor. But there was no flipping this. Not tonight. The younger officer, his name tag read M. Dawson, shifted uncomfortably again. His fingers tapped against his belt, his gaze darting between Marcus and his fellow officers. He had been silent the whole time, but now something in his face had changed. Guilt? Fear? Maybe both. "You knew I was coming, didn't you?" Marcus said, directing his question at Buzzcut. "You thought I was just another random guy driving through." Buzzcut squared his shoulders, trying to regain control. "Like I said, we were responding to a call." Marcus let out a quiet chuckle, cutting him off. "A call about what?" "A black Jeep. A suspicious man driving down the road." His voice stayed calm, but there was something sharp underneath. Or was it just another excuse? Dawson looked down, exhaling through his nose. He knew. The tension thickened. One of the other officers, a stocky man with a shaved head, took a step forward. "All right, let's all relax here," he said, trying to sound reasonable. "Maybe we got a little carried away. Maybe there was a misunderstanding." Marcus studied him for a moment. A misunderstanding. That was their play now. He had seen these officers' records. Complaints that went unanswered, videos that mysteriously disappeared, reports that never made it past the desk. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern. "You think that's all this is?" Marcus asked, his voice low. "A misunderstanding." No one answered. Dawson rubbed a hand over his face, looking like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. His gaze flicked to Marcus, then to Buzzcut, then back down to the cracked pavement. Marcus turned his attention back to Buzzcut. "How many people have you done this to?" His voice wasn't loud, but it hit like a hammer. "How many people didn't get the chance to say who they were before you smashed their windows?" Buzzcut's lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't laughing anymore. None of them were. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. No one moved. No one spoke. The street, once filled with cocky laughter and the sharp crack of glass breaking, was now eerily silent. Marcus could feel the shift, the moment where power started slipping from their hands. But he wasn't done yet. He took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto Buzzcut, who stood rigid, jaw clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might crack. "You think this is going away?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but unshakable. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" Buzzcut exhaled sharply through his nose, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The others weren't backing him up anymore. They were realizing what was happening, realizing that they were standing on a sinking ship, and Marcus was the one holding the last life raft. Dawson took a shaky breath. His fingers twitched at his side, and the first time he spoke, "I." He stopped himself, casting a nervous glance at the others. "I didn't." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know who you were." Marcus turned to him. "That's the problem," he said. "It shouldn't matter." Dawson's face fell. Buzzcut stiffened. "All right," he said, his voice measured. "You've made your point." He took a step back, motioning to the other officers. "Let's all go home." Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think it's that easy?" He gestured toward the shattered glass on the ground, the dents in his Jeep. "You're just gonna walk away and pretend this never happened." Reynolds stopped just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Marcus, then at Buzzcut, then at the broken Jeep. His eyes lingered on the shattered glass, the deep dents in the hood. The evidence was everywhere. "Inspector Daniels," Reynolds said finally, his tone smooth but firm, "you've been making a lot of noise." Buzzcut smirked like he already knew what was coming next. The other officers stood a little straighter, emboldened by Reynolds' presence. Marcus didn't blink. He had known there were higher-ups protecting these guys, but he hadn't expected them to reveal themselves so boldly. This wasn't just a case of a few bad cops. This went all the way up the chain. Reynolds exhaled, glancing at Buzzcut. "You and your team," he said slowly, "are relieved of duty, effective immediately." Buzzcut's smirk vanished. "What?" The word barely made it past his lips. The other officers shifted, their confidence draining. Reynolds reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. "We've received multiple reports. The department's been conducting its own investigation." His voice was steady, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. "Your actions tonight confirmed everything." Buzzcut took a step back, his hands clenching into fists. "You can't be serious." Reynolds didn't flinch. "You're done." Dawson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The other officers stood frozen, processing what had just happened. Marcus, however, wasn't convinced. Something about the way Reynolds delivered the news, too smooth, too rehearsed, felt off. Then he saw it. The way Reynolds' hand hovered near his belt, the slight tension in his shoulders. This wasn't justice. This was containment. Reynolds wasn't here to clean up the department. He was here to make sure the corruption didn't spill any further, to cut off the infected limb before it spread. And that meant Marcus was still in danger. The realization hit just as Reynolds took another step forward, lowering his voice so only Marcus could hear. "You should leave town," he murmured, "while you still can." Marcus held Reynolds' gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. Leave town. That wasn't a warning. It was a threat, wrapped in polite advice. The game wasn't over, not really. The department might have sacrificed a few officers to save itself, but the deeper corruption still thrived beneath the surface. And Reynolds, he wasn't here to serve justice. He was here to make sure Marcus didn't dig any further. Buzzcut stood frozen, disbelief still written all over his face. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, and now, in a single moment, everything had crumbled. His mouth opened like he wanted to argue, to fight back, but no words came. He knew it was over. The others, the ones who had stood by his side, slowly backed away, as if trying to separate themselves from the fallout. Dawson let out a shaky breath. He looked at Marcus, something shifting in his eyes. He had been part of this system for too long, watching, staying silent. But tonight, something had changed. Without a word, he stepped forward and unhooked his badge from his uniform. The metal gleamed under the streetlights as he placed it on the hood of Marcus's Jeep. Then, with one last glance at the others, he turned and walked away. Reynolds barely reacted. He had seen officers break before. One more badge on the ground meant nothing to him. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not going anywhere." Reynolds studied him, then let out a quiet sigh, like a man who had already predicted this response. "Suit yourself," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. but don't expect this to end the way you think it will. The tension in the air didn't break, but something about it shifted. The night was still, the only sound coming from the distant hum of the city. Marcus took one last look at the scene, his damaged jeep, the scattered glass, the officers who had just realized they weren't as protected as they thought. Then, without another word, he stepped into his car, ignoring the cracks in the windshield and the dents along the hood. The engine rumbled to life. As he pulled away, he caught one last glimpse of Reynolds in the rearview mirror, standing there watching. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, Marcus had done what he came to do. He had exposed them, forced them into the light. And if they thought they could make him disappear, they were dead wrong. Buzzcut didn't answer. Marcus turned slightly, just enough to catch Dawson's eye. "You still think you can stand by and say nothing?" he asked. Dawson looked down, breathing heavily. The weight of the moment was crushing him, pressing down on whatever shred of morality he had left. His foot scuffed against the pavement, like he wanted to step forward but couldn't. The conflict was written all over his face. A crackle of static broke the silence. The radio on Buzzcut's belt buzzed again. "Unit 4, we have a report of." The dispatcher's voice trailed off, then returned, this time sharper, more alert. "Unit 4, do you copy? We have an urgent report regarding an ongoing investigation." A pause. Inspector Daniels is in the area. Marcus watched their faces drain of color. The dispatcher continued. "All units are to stand down and report to headquarters immediately for questioning." Buzzcut's hand curled into a fist. Marcus took another step closer. "Now what?" he asked, his voice steady. The air was so tense it felt like the entire street might crack beneath them. No one dared to move. Buzzcut's fingers twitched near his radio, his breathing controlled but heavy. Marcus could see the gears turning in his head, the desperation creeping in. The dispatcher's words had confirmed it. There was no talking his way out. No spinning this into another routine stop. This was bigger than any of them had expected. But then something shifted. Instead of backing down, Buzzcut squared his shoulders and let out a slow breath. His face hardened, and for the first time since Marcus revealed who he was, a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You think you've won," Buzzcut said, voice quieter now, but sharper, more calculated. "You really think walking into this street alone was a smart move?" Marcus didn't respond right away. He had seen enough to know when someone was bluffing. But something about Buzzcut's tone, the way the other officers weren't scrambling for an exit anymore, sent a ripple of unease through him. Then, behind him, the low rumble of an engine cut through the silence. Headlights flicked on down the street, their bright beams cutting into the night. Another patrol car. Marcus's pulse ticked up slightly. And then another. From the opposite end of the street, a third set of headlights appeared. Marcus's jaw tightened. Buzzcut's smirk widened. "Looks like you weren't the only one expecting a meeting tonight." Dawson stiffened, his eyes darting between Marcus and the approaching vehicles. His fingers twitched at his side again. The other officers, once frozen in uncertainty, seemed to find some comfort in the sight of backup. Marcus glanced at his jeep, damaged but still drivable. If this was some kind of power move, they had already overplayed their hand. The moment those new officers stepped out of their cars, they would have a choice to make. But Marcus wasn't about to wait and see which way they leaned. Buzzcut took a step closer, voice lowering. "You really think Internal Affairs has a whole department on your side? You think everyone's just waiting to pat you on the back and thank you for showing up?" He tilted his head. "You've made a lot of enemies, Daniels." Marcus didn't flinch. He had spent years cleaning out officers like Buzzcut, ones who thought their badge made them untouchable. But if tonight was proof of anything, it was that corruption ran deeper than most people ever realized. The first patrol car slowed to a stop. The driver's side door opened. A figure stepped out, their face still obscured by the blinding headlights. Buzzcut exhaled, stretching his neck like a man who had just won a fight. Now, let's see how this really plays out. Marcus stood his ground as the patrol cars lined the street, their headlights flooding the pavement in a harsh, white glare. The first officer stepped out, a tall figure in a crisp uniform, his badge catching the light. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension was suffocating, pressing down like the weight of an entire department's secrets. Buzzcut folded his arms, looking too pleased with himself. "Looks like it's not just you calling the shots tonight, Daniels." His voice dripped with arrogance, like he'd just played his trump card. But Marcus barely glanced at him. His focus was on the officer approaching from the lead car. As the figure moved closer, the details of his face sharpened under the streetlights. And then, just like that, Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. It was Captain Reynolds. The same captain who had signed off on multiple disciplinary reports, the same one who had dismissed countless complaints against officers like Buzzcut.